Hello, everyone. My name is Shahzad Mirza, and welcome to the DMARC Bootcamp. We're not going to start quite yet. It's about a minute until the start time. We are expecting quite a large number of people to attend today's webinar. So we'll probably start a minute, probably 2 minutes after the actual start time. So, please be patient and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will wait another few minutes, so about 7:02 Eastern, we will get started because we're still expecting quite a large number of people to attend this session. In the meantime, just a few housekeeping things. So everybody is currently muted. However, if you do have any questions in the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a box for you to post any questions that you may have. Feel free to post any questions throughout the webinar. We'll do our best to answer those questions during the webinar. However, if we can't get to those questions, we'll try our best to answer them at the end of the session, or we'll probably respond to you afterwards, after the session is completed, and send you either an email or a note just to let you know or give you an answer to that question. So we'll start in about a minute or so. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the DMARC Bootcamp. So we're in week 1, and we're just starting off and kicking off the boot. Hopefully that should fix it. So again, if there are any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask those questions by using the GoToWebinar control panel and using that questions box and post it. So thank you to everyone who just let me know about the audio. So let's go ahead and get started with the session. So what we're going to do in this first webinar is basically just first go over what the plan is for the bootcamp. So that way you're aware of what's going on and what do you need to do and what's going on at this point. So the next step after that, then we'll go right into the DMARC and talk about what exactly DMARC is and why you're all going through this session and why this bootcamp is going to be very critical and important for you. So just go through the bootcamp plan. So there are obviously multiple webinars that we're going through because the whole idea behind the bootcamp was that it's very difficult to, one, go through DMARC in just an hour session. The most you can do in an hour session is give a very high level overview what DMARC is. But then at the same time, we thought about like, well, trying to get a large group of people in one room for about anywhere between 5 to 6 hours just to talk about DMARC would also be very difficult to do as well. Because it is something actually that we did try and we didn't get as good of a results as we liked. So we decided let's go for an online version. Let's do a series of webinars over 6 weeks. So that way people can attend and can spend at least an hour of their time during each of the weeks to get what they need and get the information that they need. So as you know, so this is the first session. So this is just the bootcamp introduction and a high-level overview of DMARC. So we're not going to get too technical in this session. So we'll show you a few things that may be technical, but we're not going to do a complete deep dive into everything. The next few sessions after this is where we will do more of a deep dive and get much more technical. So the one that's next week on Wednesday, September 18th, we will go into what exactly SPF and DKIM are, what are the tags associated with it. Then the following 2 weeks, so which are week 3 and 4, we're going to have the technical details about the DMARC policy itself. So what are the tags? Why are each of these tags important? Which tags are necessary, which ones are not necessary. But then at the same time, what we'll do is we'll actually show you how to implement the policy. But we'll also actually show you how to implement SPF and DKIM as well. So we'll do all those. We're going to actually use Office 365 as our email provider, and we're going to also use, if time allows, we'll also use the Google G Suites as well. So for weeks 3 and 4, you have 2 choices. You do not have to attend both. So there's no part 1 or part 2. So if you're doing the first one, DMARC Technical Details and Windows DNS, you can join the September 24th, or you can join the September 30th. They both will be the same session. Or you're more than welcome to join both. So for some reason you feel the first session, you didn't quite get everything that you needed or everything, you may have missed something, you can always join the September 30th again and listen to this session over and get the information again. So in some cases, what I would recommend, join the September 24th one, listen to everything, get all the information that you need, watch the demo and the demonstrations of the implementation, then September 30th, maybe come back and have your own DNS instance up and running and implement the policy while we're doing it in that second session. So we'll do it on Windows DNS. We're going to do it on a bind, so a Linux server, and I'll show you how to do it in Cloud DNS. So with Cloud DNS, we're just going to be using Google Cloud DNS, and I'm going to show you how to using oneandone.com or Ionis. It's pretty much going to be the same for most cloud service providers. So even if you use GoDaddy or any other Cloud DNS, it should pretty much look the same. There might be subtle differences in terms of how you get to it, but overall, it is the same implementation. Then the last weeks, 5 and 6, are going to be very important because now once you have DMARC in place, you need to know what are the next steps. Because what we're going to do during the bootcamp is get you to the lowest level policy for DMARC. And at the lowest level, you'll have DMARC, but it's not going to be in an enforcement level. So meaning it's not going to actually do anything. It's not going to really protect you because you have to get to the higher levels in order to get those level of enforcement and protection that you need. So that's why weeks 5 and 6 are going to be important, because during these sessions, each of these subject matter experts are going to show you what these reports look like, what steps you need to take in order to make adjustments so that way you can get to the highest level. So it's very important. I mean, yes, they're going to use their tools to show you how to do it, but later on in this webinar, I'll show you what an actual report looks like. And you'll see why it's important to at least attend these sessions, whether you use one of these vendors' tools or if you decide to use one of the free tools. Because even if you decide to use the free tools, you need to know what to look for. And these subject matter experts will show you what you need to look for. So that way, even if you use a free tool, you have an idea of what you're getting into and what things you need to look for to make adjustments and get up to the enforcement level. So I do recommend that you get to these and join one of these sessions during weeks 5 and 6. And then the last one is on October 7th is a DMARC Bootcamp wrap-up session. So basically just wrap up everything. I'm going to show you all the free tools. I'm going to at least list all the free tools that are available to you that you can use for reporting. I'm just not going to go into the deep dive of the analysis because, again, from the GCA standpoint, we don't actually have a free tool that you can use. So that's the bootcamp session. If you do have any questions, feel free to post them now. I'm gonna go into the actual presentation itself now at this point. I mean, if you do have any questions about the bootcamp, or if you haven't gotten the registration for the remainder of the webinars, please shoot an email to me at gca-dmarc@globalcyberalliance.org, and we'll be happy to send you the links again for the registration of the remainder of the sessions. So let's get into this. So before we can even talk about DMARC, you have to understand phishing. So I'm pretty sure majority of you already know what phishing is and what are the aspects of phishing. But the reason I want to go into this is because I want to tell you that with DMARC, it's not going to resolve all your phishing sessions or phishing attacks. It's going to resolve most of them, and it's going to be a specific one, which I'll mention in a bit. So slides will be available, and this session is being recorded at this point in time. So when it comes to phishing, so why is phishing important, right? Because phishing is going to be what attackers are going to use to collect information. They're coming to you to get whatever information they can get to either do future attack, do current attacks, steal information from you, right? Because they're going to look to get username and passwords. But in some cases, attackers want to just go for the easy thing. We want your tax information, we want your credit card information, and we want your banking information. So those are the things that we want. Those are the things we need because we can steal money and get money that way. But if they get your username and passwords, they can do a longer attack at that point. So ultimately, what this is going to lead to is some level of infection, right? And ransomware being the huge thing right now, right? Because it just seems to be very prevalent. It seems to be growing, even though they're saying in the EMEA region that business email compromise actually surpassed the ransomware, but business email compromise can lead to things like ransomware and other types of infections. But the worst part is when it comes to fraud and the theft of PII, right? Because we don't want to have false wire transfer requests. We don't want emails going to partners or citizens that are going to say that, hey, you need to donate this amount of money, or you owe this amount of money to the Department of Motor Vehicles or for your taxes and things like that. But yet phishing is still continuously being successful. And why? Because it is getting hard and harder to determine if messages are coming from a legitimate source. Because most people look at the body, and the body does look very convincing. You know, their spelling errors are starting to get minimized and disappear. So these are things that are going on and things that are happening in why it's being successful. But the other aspect is even if you tell people, make sure you look at who it's coming from. Well, when you look at the from on the default, it doesn't always tell you, it just tells you like the name of the person. It doesn't always show you the actual email address that that is being used. So it depends on really which client. So if you do have in a corporate environment, make sure that the hidden email address is actually being shown as well. But the worst part is what if they're actually using your domain name? So that's going to be very important and very, something that we need to focus on here. And that's what DMARC is going to help, because they can use the actual domain name in the from and the sender address section. So this is where DMARC is going to come into play. So just like in any standard security type presentation, you're going to have stats. So we have stats here that we're showing on a global level and in different locations. But I mean, in most cases, what we're seeing with phishing, that either it stays stagnant or it actually does increase. So this is where we need to do our best to try to show a decrease. Like, for example, in Europe, it's saying there was a 9% increase in phishing volume for just Great Britain in 2018, right? In the US, the actual volume of phishing attacks targeting US organizations rose by more than 40% in 2018. New Zealand is a 93% increase in the phishing volume. So, I mean, it keeps increasing and it keeps going up, and we need to make sure we have the appropriate technical mechanisms in there, as well as having the appropriate education to the users as to what a phishing email looks like and what they need to look out for. But what's more critical is the numbers behind this, right? So sometimes the statistics aren't enough. But here's the dollar amounts. So when it comes to business email compromise, so business email compromise could be, it could be something along the phishing lines, but it could also be the actual compromise of an email server. But if you look here, so I mean, cities, anywhere between $800,000 to $1.73 million were lost because of business email compromise, right? And it's not just cities; it's going to be any type of organization. It's like even a religious institution. 1.75 million was lost because of a business email compromise. And that's a large amount of money. And what this ends up doing is it hurts the reputation of that organization, because next thing you know, you're in the news. So-and-so lost. And this is all four of these numbers are from a news source. So bleepingcomputers.com. It's from a news source. And you get out in the news, it hurts your reputation, it hurts your trust. And people don't know whether emails are coming from you, or they're coming from something that's a spammer or a phisher at this point. So this is why it's important to have these things in place and make sure that you have the appropriate mechanisms in place. So now there are different types of spoofing, right? There's display name spoofing. That's where you see the company name and this is the company name here, and this is actually should be a person at yahoo.com. So that's actually using like a Yahoo or a Hotmail .com type information in order for this. So this should actually say person at yahoo.com, not company.com. Domain spoofing is where you're actually using the legitimate domain. And then lookalike domain spoofing, where it looks like it's the domain name, but it's not. They just use the right letters or the right combination of letters. So when somebody quickly looks at it, it looks like company.com. When in actuality, it's using a 0, R, and an N. And this is quite common with Microsoft, because R and N, if you combine them and you look at them really quickly, it does look like an M. So people will use RN soft, Microsoft, just to pretend that they're Microsoft.com. So now when it comes to protection, each one of these types of spoofing there's a different mechanism that you're using in order to protect yourself from these types of spoofing, right? There's not one solution. So it's going to be a layered solution when it comes to this. So one of the solutions, obviously, in this case, what we're going to be going over for the next several weeks is DMARC, right? So DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. So each of the weeks, we pretty much broke them up into authentication, reporting, and conformance sections. And I'm going to go through a high level through this, and I'll tell you which weeks we're going to be covering each of these sections in much more detail. But what the thing is when it comes to DMARC, DMARC only protects against domain spoofing, when someone is actually legitimately using your company name in the actual sending box. So it's coming from person at company.com. So it's not, pretending to be from company.com. They're actually using your domain name. So what is DMARC going to do? So one thing that you need to know about DMARC, there's actually two parts to DMARC. There's a policy and there's also a verification side. So you have to actually have both parts in order for DMARC to be successful. So the first part is the policy, and our main focus throughout the weeks is going to be the policy side. The policies, when you create the policy, that's going to be what tells the recipient of those messages that these messages are protected. So this way, when the messages go out through the email server on the sending side, they have the appropriate metadata information in there, and the recipient says, okay, well, these messages are being protected. We need to go through these checks just to make sure everything passes or if everything fails. But one of the great benefits of DMARC is that you as the sending organization can dictate what actually happens with that message. The recipient doesn't have to make that decision. So when the recipient side, the recipient email server is going to have DMARC verification enabled. So that way it checks for DMARC. If that's not available or if it's not turned on, then DMARC is not going to be utilized by that recipient end. Overall benefits of when you implement DMARC is going to prevent spammers from using your organization name, right? So what that's going to do is going to hopefully reduce the amount of email fraud, of infections, and so on. And ultimately, what this is going to do is increase the customer confidence and trust and protect the integrity of your organization. Those are going to be the key things. So this is not only a security mechanism, but this is also a trust mechanism that you're creating and you're putting into place, right? Because you want your brand to be trusted. You don't want to be that next person that's in the news that's because of business email compromise lost X amount of dollars, and now customers are going to be like, well, you know what? Should I be really using or going to this, either whether the store or going to this trusted government entity or whatever organization it is, because they keep losing money or they keep getting compromised. So this is why you want to have DMARC in place to help you with that level of protection. Again, like I said, it's not your cure-all, but at least it's a critical layer that if you implement it, you're going to reduce those amounts of phishing attacks. Other benefits is that on the consumer side, they already have this protection. So the consumer side, they have DMARC verification enabled. They don't know it, but they do. So this is about 80% of the current total number of worldwide email accounts. So what do I mean by consumer side? So I mean Gmail, I mean Hotmail, I mean MSN, I mean Yahoo, just to name some of the bigger vendors, right? All the email service providers that provide consumer level, personal level email accounts have DMARC verification enabled. But the problem is that the organization needs to create those domains, or sorry, the domain level DMARC policy. So the organizations out there on the global level need to do their part by implementing DMARC, right? Because it's two parts. The verification's on the consumer side, but the policy has to be created on the organization side. The other thing that DMARC is going to do is it's actually going to improve deliverability, right? Because since DMARC verification is enabled on these large providers, that means they're checking to see, are these messages authenticated? This is how they're checking your reputation as well. So it's another layer of reputation when they go out to check those reputation systems. They can say, okay, hey, look, they have DMARC, and look, all the authentication checks pass, so there is an authentication level in place. So that means that this message is good. So therefore, deliver it straight to the inbox. There are cases where some of these large providers will have other layers of filters that may override DMARC, but it's not too common. So, and this is really important too with the deliverability, because we have seen cases where, especially with Google has stopped messages because of reputation. Because if they see a large amount of spam, what they will consider spam messages, whether you're sending them or not, they will start blocking you. They will block your account, your account, and you will no longer be able to send to any Gmail user, whether it's a business Gmail user or if it's a personal Gmail user. You will no longer be able to send to them until you actually have DMARC in place. And then you improve your reputation. Now they will start allowing you to send this. And we've seen this cases with cities, with healthcare organizations, and with the retail side. So it does impact it. So by doing this, you will increase and improve the deliverability of your messages. But you got to be at an enforcement level. You can't be at the lowest level of DMARC. It has to be at a high level of DMARC. At the lowest level, they won't do anything, and then they'll tell you, get to the highest level of enforcement, then we'll consider your reputation improved. The other thing is visibility, and this is where the reporting part comes into play, because those reports are going to be critical, because that report is going to define what is wrong with the messages that are being delivered, right? Because the reports actually come from the recipient server. These aren't from your servers. It's from the receiving side, the ones who are actually getting the messages. They're the ones who are actually going to tell you what's going on with the message, and that's important, because you know that the messages are being sent, but you may not know that whether the messages are being delivered or not. And that's what DMARC is going to tell you. And then you're going to see from those reports, okay, some of these servers that the report is saying are spammers or phishers are actually legitimate servers. These are actually IP addresses or domains we use to send from. So we need to make sure we make our adjustments to the authentication mechanisms that DMARC uses, so that way these messages actually get through, especially when we get to a higher level. So this is why the visibility is important, because then when you decide to get to the higher level of enforcement, now you have more of a better comfort level that you actually have things set up. So DMARC reports provide that visibility. It's the only reports that actually provide that level of visibility. So it's important to get those reports. So now I've mentioned before, there are two parts to DMARC, right? There is the policy and there's a verification. So the policy is actually free to use. The reason why is because everyone has DNS. That's the only way you're getting out to the internet. If you have a website, you put it on a DNS system, because that's the only way someone can get to it. If you have email addresses, you have a DNS system. That's the only way people can send you an email because you have to have DNS. So this is where your policy is actually being created. The verification part, I'm saying that there will have a cost. I put stars there because it could be that you already have a system that does the verification. You just have to turn it on, right? So a good number of email security gateways, some spam and anti-spam filters will actually have that checkbox in there. Just go in there and turn on the check, and you'll check for all incoming messages to see if they have DMARC enabled on them, and to act accordingly based on the sending organization's policy to what they need to do with those messages. So there's a question I'm actually going to, because somebody is asking here. So is that a block at the domain level or individual user when Gmail does that? So when Gmail does that, it actually ends up doing it at the domain level, not the individual user. So in terms of the deliverability, that block is at the domain level. So they'll actually look at your domain and say, okay, well, this is the domain. Good chance that there's 100 spam messages or 1,000 spam messages. We're going to block that domain. So that hurts your reputation. And honestly, I mean, the only way, like, we helped a few of these places out, once we implemented DMARC and the associated authentication mechanisms, and then we also had to do there's also a Google verification domain aspect too. We implemented all that, and everything started going on at that point. Can you use DMARC if you use your own DNS servers? Yes, you can. So that's why in weeks 3 and 4, we'll actually show you so the Windows DNS, that means it's your own in-house DNS server. So for Windows and Bind, those are typically the ones you have in-house within your organization. We'll show you how to implement it on both of those systems. So yes, you can use DMARC if you have your own DNS servers. So what does DMARC apply to? Honestly, it applies to any public domain, whether you use it for email or not. You should implement DMARC. So if you own a website, that means you own a domain name. Even if you don't use that domain for email purposes, because what some small businesses will do, they'll purchase their domain, company.com, they'll put up a website at company.com, but they don't use it for email. They won't use at company.com. They'll use a Gmail account or a Yahoo account, because it saves costs. So that's fine, but you can still implement DMARC at that domain, right? You own that domain, implement DMARC, because by implementing DMARC at the highest level of enforcement, you're preventing people from using that domain name as an email. So you're still having preventative measures in place. And again, during weeks 3 and 4, we'll show you actually how to do that as well. So some things that you need for implementation. So you need to know your mail servers. I mean, your mailing systems and your servers. So whether they be third-party mailing systems or your internal servers, they're important because that's something you get to use for one level of authentication. You also do need to have access to your DNS, right? You need to have admin level, or at least access to somebody who has admin levels, because in most cases, some organizations will have change control. So you have to submit it for change control, and it goes through the process of approval, and then your DNS admins will put it into place and implement it. So that is important. So we need to make, you need to have that, because that's where, again, that's where all the authentication mechanism in DMARC is all going to go into DNS. Some items to plan for, and we're going to go through these throughout the weeks, and some of it we're going to go through today as well. You need to have a good understanding of SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, obviously. So SPF and DKIM are the two authentication mechanisms that DMARC uses in order for it to be effective. So webinar 2, so the one next week, we will go into detail in terms of SPF and DKIM. In the next few slides, I'll go into the next slide, actually. I will tell you what both of those are, but not go into a deep dive on it. You need to understand the 3 policy levels of DMARC. So what's the lowest level and what's the highest level, and what each level does, and why it's critical to get to the highest level. You need to know whether your email server supports DKIM or not. And again, this is something that we'll talk about next week. So what kind of things to look for and such. You should have a list of your public domains used by the organization. Why? Because that's going to help you, because in that way, by having that list, you'll know that, okay, these are the ones that I need to apply DMARC. Oh, these are the ones we don't use for email, but I still need to apply DMARC at the highest level. These are the ones that use email, so I need to be a little bit more cautious. But you will run into unknowns, right? So like, are you using third-party vendors or not? For a small organization, it might be easier to get that information, for medium to larger size, it might be harder, because there could be teams that just don't tell you that we're using these tools, right? Because you say, oh, hey, let's sign up for, I don't know, MailChimp. And we can use that to send mail out to people, because our email admins are restricted the number of people we can send emails to in one email. Whereas if you use this third-party vendor, we can send it out to 1,000 users at once, right? And the other problem you may run into is, do they support SPF and or DKIM? So those are things to look of. Mail systems that IT staff are unaware of, right? Because there could be like a developer group that's set up their own mail server just for testing purposes and is actually being used to send mail. Again, the IT staff may not be aware of that. Nice thing is that once you implement DMARC at the lowest level and you have reporting enabled, it'll actually tell you all of this. It'll give you all this information. So that's why those reports are important. Figure out whether you have subdomains or not, because it's going to depend on whether you're going to create a DMARC policy for those subdomains or not. So you need to know if those subdomains exist and are they being used for email, because that can make things, it's going to take more time when it comes to implementing DMARC. And then be prepared for DMARC report analysis, right? Because one thing is you need to define where you want to send those reports to. So maybe create a generic mailbox to send those reports to. But then you have to be prepared to see, how many reports you may or may not get. So these are things that you need to consider and plan for. In case anyone is taking notes, we are going to share this in the slides. The webinar is being recorded as well, but we're also created a checklist which contains this information. So we'll be providing that to you as well. Once we have our page set up and ready to go, you'll get an email this week, probably about Thursday, that gives you the links to these resources. Yeah, the items to plan for are going to go into, we're going to go into greater detail, not in this session, but in the following session. So SPF and DKIM will be week 2. The 3 levels of policies will go into today, as well as weeks 3 and 4. Supporting of DKIM will go into week 2, so next week. The other things are things that you basically have to get on your own, because that's information within your organization. Now, in order to proper implement DMARC, so one, we already said you need DNS, right? You should need to have access to DNS, and you're going to be creating the policy in there. So you need that, obviously, in order for proper implementation. But for authentication, what DMARC uses are SPF and DKIM. So Sender Policy Framework and Domain Keys Identified Mail. So SPF, what is that? That's your list of authorized systems that are used to send messages using your domain. So these are the ones that are allowed. So those are the mail servers allowed to send on your behalf. So it could be your own internal servers that you have, or it could be your cloud service provider, or it could be a third-party vendor that you're using to do for marketing and sales and whatnot, right? Or like Salesforce, MailChimp, HubSpot, Constant Contact, and so on. Those are all the things that you would put onto this list. DKIM, or Domain Keys Identified Mail, is going to be a digital signature that gets added to every message that's leaving your servers, or a third-party server that allows for DKIM, that you've set up for allowing for DKIM. These two things we're going to go into more detail next week. We'll talk about the tags associated with it, what the record will actually look like as well, and go into more detail on actually how the flow of SPF and DKIM works. So those are the things we're going to go into week 2. So we'll go more detail into that. So the different levels of DMARC. So what happens to these messages? There's different levels. There are 3 different policies settings that you can put in, right? So 1 DMARC policy per domain. So you get none, quarantine, and reject. None being the lowest, reject being the highest. At none, what you're doing is if you put in DMARC policy of none, you're putting yourself into what I like to call monitored only mode. So meaning that nothing happens to the messages based on deliverability or the recipient side. The messages go through the regular channels and regular filters and gets delivered to the inbox. So nothing is getting blocked because of DMARC at this point. And the reason you go at this level is because you want to check to make sure those 2 previous authentication mechanisms of SPF and or DKIM are set up correctly. You know, is the IP or domain that's using to send your messages in your SPF authorized list? Is there a DKIM signature associated with them? No, we need to make these adjustments. So this way you can make the adjustments before you get to the higher levels, because once you're at quarantine and reject, this is where now messages are potentially getting blocked at this point, right? Because if you're at quarantine, if SPF and or DKIM and or alignment were to fail, all messages will be sent to the spam or junk folder. At reject, if any one of those authentication mechanisms were to fail, the message is not delivered at all. Right? They're not delivered at all in this case. And that's where you want to be, because you want, you know, hopefully if you do it right, all the spammers and phisher messages are the ones that are being rejected and dropped. And all your authorized and approved authentication ones are actually being sent through. So that's why start out at none and then make your way up to reject. And it has happened before when people put in reject and it completely broke email. So you have to be very careful with this. So again, the goal of the bootcamp is by the end of week 4, we hopefully get everyone up to, all the people who do not have DMARC policy, hopefully get you up to none. Those of you who are at none, hopefully after weeks 5 and 6, and maybe a few weeks after weeks 5 and 6, we get you all the way up to reject. So how the actual flow happens. So for a reject, you still get a notification. So at the reject level, as long as you're getting reports, you will get a notification. So it's not like an email notification that you're going to receive. You're basically looking at the reports. The reason you don't get an email notification is because not everyone by default has something set up to do those types of notifications. I know some of the consumer mailboxes do, like Google does, do something like that, but most other providers don't do something like that. So true that O365 does not honor the reject policy. I have not heard of that. I mean, they do honor the reject policy. However, they do also have additional filters that can potentially override that reject policy. So there are multiple factors that do come into play when it comes to the Microsoft side. So that's where it becomes, you know, somewhat of an issue. Is reject considered as a bounce? So does it have a specific SMTP code? No, it's not considered as a bounce. So the recipient side will not know that the message is bounced. The sending user will not know that the message has been bounced. So again, this is where the reports come into play. The reports are where you're going to see that this message is being bounced. Or if someone is kind enough at the IT side of the recipient end to say, hey, look, we're not getting your messages because of this error code, they'll let you know that way. So this is why, I keep reiterating reports. The reports are important, whether they need to be reviewed, every so often. And when you're at reject, you can still get those reports, but you may not need to review them as often until something actually happens. So how does the actual flow work? So for the sender, so the user end, at the person sitting in the inbox typing out the message and sending out the email, this is completely transparent to them. They won't know that any of this is happening unless you tell them that this is actually happening or this actually exists. Okay? So first off, what you have to do is you publish your DMARC records. You publish that in DNS. You put in their record, say whatever level policy that you're at this point. And you put that on your organization's DNS server. The user at the sender's inbox type out their messages and hit send. They don't have to tick anything or press anything special to say, okay, you're putting in DMARC or you're putting in SPF or DKIM. They don't have to do anything in this case. They just hit send. The message goes to the sending org's email server, and this is where all the header information and the additional data is being added into. So this is where the DKIM signature is being added. This is where, the IP information is pretty much actually already there and is always there in the header information. And also supplies that there's DMARC applied to this message. And it sends the message out. Now at the recipient's end, so again, remember there's a verification side as well. So on the recipient side, if they do not have DMARC verification, then the message just flows through as if, just flows right through. And it goes to the recipient's inbox. It'll still go through the normal spam and anti-phishing filters or any other filters that they may have in place, but ultimately, if everything passes, it should go through the recipient's inbox. If they do have DMARC verification enabled, then it's going to now go back to the sending organization's DNS server and say, okay, do you have DMARC? What's your policy? Okay, we need to go through the checks. We need to check SPF. We need to check DKIM. Does everything pass? Does everything fail? Does part of it fail? Then this is what we need to do. Right? So if it's at level none, it passes on as if it's a valid email. If it's at quarantine, it goes to the recipient's spam or junk folder. If it's at reject, the message is completely dropped and not delivered. So they don't even know that the message was even being sent to them. And then the last step is going to be that the recipient email server will send a report back. Now, just to be clear about these reports, so not all recipient email servers will send reports back to you. So not everyone is going to send something back. Because I know some of the bigger providers don't, like Microsoft and Proofpoint, don't send reports back to the sending organization. They're making changes and adjustments, so they should at some point, hopefully. So there's one question here. I have DMARC implemented on quarantine. Looking at a report, I have an email that passes DKIM but fails the SPF policy on alignment. What does this mean, and why has it passed DMARC compliance? All right. So that's a great question. That's actually a question that's going to be dealt with in weeks 5 and 6. But just to quickly answer that question, for DMARC, it doesn't technically require both DKIM and SPF to pass. As long as one passes, you should be okay. So you can just pass SPF and you can pass just DKIM, but as long as because that's legitimate. Because spoofing the DKIM key is not easy to do and can be very difficult. So that's where you're probably passing it. But again, this is where you go into detail in weeks 5 and 6. These are those details that they're going to go through, that these subject matter experts will go through and show you how these look like and what the detail is, and be able to answer those questions better in those situations. And yes, I did say that Proofpoint does not send reports, so they don't send DMARC reports. That's what I've been told. I haven't seen any reports coming from Proofpoint users. If that's not the case, or if it's changed, then let me know, so that way I can get the information correct and accurate. So here's an example of what DMARC record looks like. So this is the TXT record, the text record. So that's the type of record you're creating. So I'm not going to go into detail about what everything looks like here. This is to give you an example of what these are. In weeks 3 and 4 is where I'm going to go into the details. So I'll talk about how you create what the host record is and why you need the underscore DMARC, and also talk about each of the tags within the value. So that's the weeks 3 and 4. We're going to go into detail for that, because that's going to take some time to go through and review. Now, reports. There are going to be 2 types of reports that you can get from DMARC. There's an aggregate report or a forensic, or what they call failure reports. The aggregate reports are the reports you definitely want to get. And the reason for that is because that's the one that's going to supply you with all the information about what's going on. So these aggregate reports will only contain the IP address of the sending domain or the sending server, and it's going to tell you information about SPF, DKIM, whether they passed, failed, or alignment in terms of DMARC and what's going on. That's the only information that these DMARC reports are going to that the aggregate reports are going to provide you. They're not going to have details. So it's not going to have the message body. It's not going to have the message subject. It's not going to have who's actually sending the message. That type of information is not in the aggregate. It's just IPs and DMARC pass fail for DKIM, SPF, and what domains are being used for DKIM and SPF. So that way you have that information to help you out with it, and not necessarily deal with any privacy concerns. The forensic or failure reports, however, are actually going to be the detailed information. That's going to actually be the full body message. So you can actually get the sending, the recipient, and the actual message for anything that fails the DMARC checks. So you want to be careful. So so aggregate reports you definitely want to get. Forensic reports I do recommend getting. I just don't recommend sending them to a third party. Have them sent to your own work account, because that could potentially contain privacy information. It could contain invoices and such. So you want to be careful with those. The other thing with forensic reports, a lot of, at least the big vendors, are not sending forensic reports any longer just for that reason, because they're concerned about the privacy aspect of it and people sending it to the wrong locations. So they cut those out and decided not to send those forensic reports. But again, it is going under debate on whether or not they should be maybe consider re-implementing those. Now, these reports do come in as zip files. The zip files contain an XML document, and they can be sent to any email address within your organization. You can't by default send it to anyone outside your organizations, because that way you don't end up spamming people, even though Google does do that still. But you have to, the receiving side, so if you're sending it to a third party, they actually have to implement something in their DNS to be able to accept those reports. So you can't just send them the reports. How many reports you're going to get, it really depends on how much email you send out on a daily basis. So if you send a large number of reports out, good chance you're going to get a large number of reports. If you send a very few, you'll get a very few. So this is why I recommend it when you send it to an email address in your organization, send it to a generic account. So that way you don't get hammered with potentially get hammered with reports in your own personal work email account. But again, these reports are critical because it's going to answer some of the questions that people are asking me right now that I see throughout here. So it's going to answer the question, do I have all my authorized servers on my SPF list? Do I have DKIM set up for everybody? Are there some missing? Can I set, okay, I do have everything set up correctly, and it looks like the rest of these are spammers and phishers. So now I can move up to the next level. So this is why it's important to have those reports and review those reports so you can get up to quarantine and reject, because that's the only way you're going to be able to do it. Because if you stay at policy none, you're not helping yourself and you're not helping anyone. You need to get to quarantine and ultimately get up to reject. So one question is, can DMARC be enabled without a location to send reports? Yes, you can. But you're gonna have a problem with that because again, if you're at DMARC policy level of none and you're not getting reports, then there was no reason to put in DMARC because it's just like not having DMARC at all. So you want to get to quarantine. The only way you're gonna get to quarantine or reject is to get those reports, analyze the reports, and review those reports. Otherwise, you're gonna have a very difficult time getting up to reject. I mean, if you're a small organization and you feel very comfortable with it and you want to go straight to reject, go for it. But again, the only way you're going to know if there's a problem is from those reports. So I only seem to be getting aggregate reports. Should I be getting both, or is this something I need to check with our developer? So in order to get both aggregate and forensic reports, you have to make sure you have the right tags in place. So just quickly, RUA is for aggregate, RUF is for forensic. And again, those things I'm going to go into detail in weeks 3 and 4. Can you change which email address reports are being sent to? Yes. If you have control over DNS, you can change those email addresses at any point in time. The question is just how quickly will your DNS make the update globally, so that way the change is being made right away. But again, those questions for the DMARC reports, you can email me about those questions, but again, weeks 5 and 6, that's where all those questions are going to be answered, and they're going to go into those details about those reports. It's all educational aspects and from weeks 5 and 6, nothing salesy. Does DMARC have performance impacts? Not that I've ever seen. No one has ever reported that DMARC having any performance impacts on the servers or on the DNS servers in any way. So someone asked about a sample aggregate report. Here you go. Here's a sample aggregate report. This is the actual XML. This is an actual one. This is actually globalcyberalliances.org's report way back when in the beginning when we actually had DMARC set up at quarantine. I mean, if you can read XML and it's easy for you to read, awesome. Go for it. Open up the text documents and take a look at them. But again, I'm telling you, this is not the way to do it. It is not easy and by any means to go through this, especially if you get a large number of reports. I've had people just look through 5 reports and they're like, I have no idea what's going on here because this report is just so long. So it is not, these reports by default are not easy to read. So you need to have some sort of human readable fashion of reading these reports, whether it be an actual vendor. And have some of the vendors have freemium levels. Some of them, you do have to pay a cost to it. Or even if you use a free tool, right? The free XML tools, XML to human type tools, they're great. They're good. You just have to put them into place and create them. But you still need to know, what are you looking at? What is this telling you? What's the information? Here I see DKIM, SPF, and something they say fail, but they also say fail on alignment. What does fail on alignment mean? Why is it showing me some other domain for SPF when I have SPF set up this way and the domain is actually here? Why is it still showing somebody else's domain? These are the questions you want to ask during weeks 5 and 6, and ask the subject matter expert these questions, because these are the things they're supposed to be going over during those weeks, and they can actually show you. They can show you using their tool that this is what it looks like. So that way you can take that information, translate it to a free tool you might be using, and then be able to answer the questions you're looking for and get to where you need to get to. So please make sure, sign up for weeks 3 and 4 if you haven't already, because that's where we're going to go to details of all the tags. We're going to go through the implementation process, and then sign up for weeks 5 and 6, because that's where you're going to get the reporting information and how to analyze, review, and then make the adjustments that you need to make to SPF and DKIM. So some concerns with implementation. DMARC is not a silver bullet, right? Because it's only protecting the domain. It only protects the domain the policies are being applied to, right? If there's no policy applied to it, it's not being protected. It doesn't protect against those variations that we mentioned. So like the lookalike domains, it's not going to protect you against those. It's not going to protect you against the name spoofing, right? Where they're using the CEO's name, but it's actually a Yahoo account behind the scenes. And it does also inherit some of the limitations of the authentication mechanisms. So like there are limitations of SPF, like 10 domain lookups and so on, which we'll talk about the workarounds in next week. And so it protects against that one type of email spoofing. It protects you against the actual domain spoofing, the actual domain usage. Could email break? It could. And that's the only times I've seen email break when DMARC is actually being used is when people actually go straight to reject. They go straight to reject. They don't bother looking at reports, and email all of a sudden, certain emails all of a sudden are not being delivered. This happened to a financial institution, a large financial institution. They were very confident in it. They implemented it, and next thing they know, the executive administrative assistant for the CEO emailed the IT department saying none of the messages, the newsletters from the CEO are being sent out. No one's getting them anymore. And the reason is because they signed up for a third-party email tool to send these messages out, but they never told IT staff or the email admins that this is being used. So when they went to reject, it blocked all those messages. So they actually had to scale back to none. They actually had the reporting enabled. They looked at the reports to get the correct information for that vendor and be able to talk to the vendor to get the information in place. They confirmed everything was set up correctly, and then they went back to reject. So you have to be careful with this. You have to be very careful. And yes, third parties is going to be the issue that a lot of people are going to have to deal with. Not enough resources, because that could be an issue, especially if you're a large or medium to large size organization. It could be also the true for small organizations, because implementing can be time consuming. If you only have one domain, getting to none is easy. It's easy. Everyone can get to none easily. I mean, it'll take you like maybe 5 minutes, unless you have change control, because then the change control could take 2 weeks or a month, depending on the organization. But implementing DMARC policy at none can happen within a few minutes. But when you start having multiple subdomains and you have these third parties, then that's where it becomes difficult to implement, and it takes longer to get up to quarantine or reject. But then we also found out resources are needed more for analysis of the reports and the actual implementation. So like I said, getting to none is easy, 5 minutes, and I'll show you next week and weeks 3 and 4 how quickly it is to implement a DMARC policy. But the problem is that once you get these reports and kind of trying to consume and analyze the reports, it's going to take time. Again, whether you use a third-party tool, like a third-party vendor, or if you use a free tool, it's going to take time. And then mailing lists and mail forwarders are not authentication friendly. It actually breaks DMARC. It actually breaks SPF and DKIM also. The only way around it, excuse me, the only way around it is for those mailing list providers and mail forwarders to actually implement something called authenticated receive chain. So you can go to arc-spec.org to review it. It actually has become a valid protocol. It passed the ITF standards, and now it actually has an RFC as well. So it is now valid and it is ready for prime time. So feel free to go into that and get to those things appropriately. So if you host your own mailing list or mail forwarders, you need to consider implementing ORC in order for a mail to get through, a mail to be delivered correctly. So I know we're getting close to the hour end, but I have a few more things here, and hopefully we'll get to the Q&A. So we released a report about the economics benefits of DMARC adoption. Just again, for those who like numbers, you can read the report. Is free to download. You don't have to register or anything to download it. Just go to www.globalcyberalliance.org. It's there. Just click on the link to download it. There's no registration to get it. But based on our analysis, based on what we saw as of August 2018, the people who have implemented DMARC at reject or quarantine, they're looking about to 19 to 66 million US in annual savings just by implementing DMARC. So trying to break it down, and this is provided something from Agari. So Agari pulled these numbers based on 4 organizations from different sectors. What they saw based on their return of investment for these organizations, they saw a 326% return on investment, $4 million increased return on customer engagement. Why? Because they're not dealing with spam. They're not dealing with fraudulent email. 1.1 million reduced need for customer support, right? Because customer support is now no longer dealing with, oh, I got this phishing email. I got this email that says your domain, but is this real or not, right? They're actually dealing with other types of things and what things that they need to. 718K reduced cost of cybersecurity insurance, and to 10% rise in response rate to email campaigns. So so don't take just our word for it. Here's something from another vendor or third party that has this information as well. So we're going to do Q&A, but let me just go through the thing. So the next webinar is the overview of SPF and DKIM. So we're going to go into detail. This is what SPF is. These are the tags that are involved, and this is what the SPF record looks like. Well, same thing with DKIM. We'll talk about what DKIM is, what are some of the tools you can use to implement and create DKIM keys and do the implementation of DKIM on your systems. And we'll go through the tags and what it looks like when you ultimately create your DKIM keys. So it's going to get quite technical next week. So a lot of deep dive and a lot of details. I'm not going to show you how to create the records quite yet. The record creation will be in weeks 3 and 4. So at this point, I mean, I know we only have a minute until the end of the webinar. We do have quite a few questions. I'm going to try my best to go through some of the questions that I did not answer. If you don't stay on, you know, again, we are going to send out an email on Thursday with some of the resources. Any questions I don't get to, I'll try my best to get to it afterwards and send you a direct email response. And also, we actually implemented a forum for people to post questions as well. The forum name is community.globalcyberalliance.org. So I will put that, or I'll have Alejandro go ahead and please put that in the chat window. So there should be a chat window available to you. And there we'll put in community.globalcyberalliance.org. So Alejandro, if you go ahead, please put that in there while I go through some of the questions and try to answer them. Do we get a certificate for attendance? You will, but if the certificate will not be provided to you unless you attend at least 6 live webinars. So it'll be provided to you towards the end. Someone provided this information. Toyota just suffered a 37 million loss from BEC. So that's a lot. So that's very important, and that's, you know, it impacts everybody and anyone. So if mail is encrypted by the user with something like Zix or maybe even PGP, will this have any impact on how DMARC works? So the encryption depends on the path and where the encryption actually takes place. So if they encrypt just the message body and then send out the email, it should have no impact. So if it's done at the user level. However, if the encryption is done at the server level, then yes, it could have an impact, because if those headers change in any way, it could create a problem. So as long as it's not done in the server level, it should be fine. And as long as the user encrypts just the message body, you should be fine. I'm from an ethical phishing simulation company. How could I impact DMARC for our organization? So if you're going to implement DMARC, just make sure you implement DMARC for your actual organization, not the actual email simulations, because that's going to be using different domains, and hopefully your DMARC policy should not have an impact on it. Worst case is, what I would recommend is in that case, make sure for the simulation part, register another domain and use that. Integration into SIM for help with analyzing reports. That's a very good question. I'm not aware of any SIMs that actually pull in DMARC reports. I'm not aware of any, but let me see if I can find out, and I will get back to you about that. If using Safe Sender list and Outlook, will these override DMARC? No, Safe Sender should not override DMARC. At least in cases, I haven't seen it in any cases where it has overridden DMARC, because the DMARC policy first occurs, the DMARC check occurs at the Microsoft server level, and it has to pass the server checks, whereas the Safe Sender check is more of a user level check rather than a server level check. So scaling up from subdomains is the best implementation approach for orgs that have large amount of domains. Yeah, that is one approach that you can do. I mean, what you could always do is, if you know at the top level domain that's not being used for email, you could always put a policy of reject, but then there's a way to make it so that that policy does not apply to the subdomains. So yes, I mean, but you could always take that approach as well. Go from the subdomains first and then do the top level. How do I double check? Yeah, please send us an email. Yeah, so if you did not get the webinars for weeks for any of the weeks, please send us an email. Please send an email to gc@dmarc@globalcyberalliance.org. Here's the email address right here. Send us an email there, and we will send you the link, the webinar links for that. But again, I mean, as long as you're registered for the bootcamp itself, you should be getting all this information. That's why it's important. Register for the bootcamp. Us just giving you the webinar links, you're going to miss out all the other information, like the resources that we're going to be sending out, you know, and other information that we may be sending out. So again, if there's any questions that we missed, there is a community forum. You can join that. So community.globalcyberalliance.org, or send me an email or send us an email at gca-dmarc@globalcyberalliance.org, and we'll make sure to answer your questions right away. Do we need to get our third-party vendor to implement DKIM at the same time we implement DKIM for our internal mail gateways? You do not have to, as long as you're at none. You don't have to. So you can, when you get to, before you go to quarantine or reject, if they have DKIM at the third-party vendor, I would recommend have them actually give you the information for DKIM so you can implement it and then move your way up to quarantine or reject. So we have reached at the end. We're actually 5 minutes over. But again, if there are any questions, feel free to ask them. If you don't have it, or you can't think of a question right now, or if I missed your question, again, we have the community forum, community.globalcyberalliance.org. Just register there and you can post your questions there. And that's, again, the community forum right now, it's only open to bootcamp registrants. Or you can email us other questions at gca-dmarc@globalcyberalliance.org, and we will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Will having simple DMARC records set to none still help our domain's reputation? No. We've only seen like Google and Microsoft and so on, they only when you're at quarantine and reject, that's when the domain's reputation actually improves. The reason for that is because, again, when you're at DMARC level none, there is nothing being blocked. Nothing is happening. So as far as Google and Microsoft and these other providers, as far as they're concerned, those spam messages are still going out. They're still being done. They're still going out. They're still being done. So staying at DMARC level none is not going to help with reputation. You need to get to quarantine or reject. In most cases, you may have to get to reject in order for your domain reputation to be improved. A lot of great questions. Thank you for putting in these questions in here. Again, I'll wait a couple more minutes. So right now it's 8:06 a.m. Eastern. I'll wait till 8:10 Eastern to close out the webinar, or sooner if there are no questions. All right, so we have some unanswered questions that I didn't get to. So do we need to get our third-party vendor implement DKIM at the same time we implement DKIM? So I did get to that one. So you don't have to wait for them, but do not move to quarantine or reject until you actually have the DKIM in place. So if RNSN is so commonly spoofed, why doesn't MSN buy the domain? That's actually a very good question. I think Microsoft might be making those moves to it, but it could also be that those domains are already previously owned by somebody else or have been taken by somebody else. So that ends up becoming an issue. Where can you check your domain's reputation? There are actually multiple sites out there that you can use to check it. And they're escaping me at the top of my head right now. But if you actually do a quick Google search for domain reputation, you should get a list of locations where you can actually check that. Just you choose any one of them, put in your domain, and it'll give you your reputation from right there. But again, this is, Google and Microsoft and them may have their own reputation list. They may not use these other reputations, so you have to take that into account. But again, this is where the DMARC reports help. The DMARC reports can let you know, okay, how many spam messages are actually being sent out, or what could potentially be spam messages. So that could actually help to see if your domain reputation is good or bad. So we have 1 minute until we could close out the session. Again, feel free to email us at gca-dmarc@Global Cyber Alliance if you have any other questions you think of afterwards, or join the community forum and post your questions there. We would prefer you post the questions on the forum, because then that hits a wider group of people, because everyone who's registered can see the question and they can see the answer to that. And yes, there will be a published link to download the session. Well, actually, we have a link to the actual video itself for people to take a look at and view at any point in time. So the question is, would it help if I identify and direct all my shadow IT SMTP servers through the corporate SMTP servers, easier to control with fewer legitimate servers? Yeah, I mean, if you have actually an email security gateway and you have all your servers go through that can actually help, because it'll actually help with the SPF part. It helps with the DKIM part as well. So, and then you have a little bit more control over what's going on with your messages. All right, so it's 8:10 a.m. Eastern. I want to thank everyone for joining. I'm looking forward to the next session and seeing everyone on the next session. So again, thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We'll see you next week.